Okay, so what we're looking at here is a representation of cross-section of a flower. So we'll go through, label the parts here, and then look at an example and see if we can pick out the parts that we're labeling in some real flowers too. So the first part, it's actually a modified stem. It's called the peduncle. A lot of times I see it labeled as a pedicel as well. That can be true if it's branched to multiple flowers. We start calling them pedicels. So like in an inflorescence or a more complicated flower, we might see that. This is a representation of just a simple flower. So one modified stem, we'll call it the peduncle. And as that gets to the end, it kind of swells and acts as an attachment point for all the other flower parts. So that's what we'll call the receptacle. It's really just the swelling at the end of the pedicel or the peduncle that acts as that attachment point. Together, the petals and the sepals make up the perianth. I guess the petals are probably the most recognizable part of a flower for most people, but together with what's called the sepals, they make up the perianth. And you can see it's labeled there as the corolla as well. One petal, we would call a petal, but together that layer of the flower is known as the corolla. And then sepals are below that, and they create another layer there, but together they're known as the calyx. And the petals, they can be different colors and patterns, typically to attract pollinators. They can be separate or they can be fused together. Some very distinct. I'm sure we can all picture flowers that are pretty distinctive because of the petals, but some of them are pretty unpronounced too. In the case of a lot of wind pollinated flowers, they're not that distinctive. They don't necessarily need to be because they don't need to attract pollinators. So it's a big function of the petals. The sepals, that's labeled there, usually 3 to 5 of them. They're kind of on the back of the flower, usually smaller than the petals. And a big function they have is when the flower is still in a bud, they're the outside layer of that bud. So a lot of times they're a little more like leathery in texture, and they kind of protect the flower when it's still in the bud. They protect all the other parts while it's still in that bud form. The large structure in the center there is called the pistil. We can further divide that into the stigma, the style, and the ovary. The stigma is at the top there. Sometimes it's just a little bit of a swelling, or sometimes it could be more like a point, and more complex flowers can be branched. But a big function it's having is to capture the pollen. The pollen then would travel down the style into the ovary. The style is just kind of a slender stalk that connects those two parts. The ovary itself eventually may develop into a fruit. Here, it's in a superior organization, so just that you can see that the ovary is on top of the receptacle. In some situations, that receptacle can kind of grow up around it, and the petals and the sepals will be above the ovary. So that's another form that you might see. In that case, the ovary is said to be inferior because it's beneath the corolla and the calyx. But in this case, it is a superior organization there. And inside the ovary, there's an ovule. The ovule is what would eventually become the seed. So as pollen gets down into the ovary through, it's the fertilization process, the seed is in there that would eventually develop in the ovary into the fruit. The stamen, kind of these smaller structures here that you can see labeled, and that can be further labeled into the anther and the filament. The filament is just kind of a stalk. It's semi-rigid, so it's meant to move around a little bit. And the anther, you can kind of think of it just like a bag of pollen. And it's got either pores or slits in it, depending on the species, but it's just meant to spread pollen around. So the filament's kind of wavy, it's not very rigid, and then it throws pollen or gets pollen on insects if the insects were, if it was an insect pollinated flower, or if it was wind pollinated, it's specialized to spread the pollen on the wind. All right, so let's try to pick out a couple of these structures on real flowers. This is These are cherry blossoms here. The most obvious thing we can probably find are the petals, big white petals kind of across the screen there. But we also see some sepals. If you look on the back side of that flower there, and you can see them at a couple other spots too. But you can see some of the sepals. Looks like there are 5 of them there that would have kind of enclosed the flower like we were talking about when it was in the bud, but now that it's open, they're kind of on the back there. We can see some pistils. They're in the center of the flowers, a little bit bigger of a structure there. And then, of course, we can see the stamen as well, the smaller structures, and you can see the filaments and the anthers as part of those if we break it down a little farther too.